Hi everyone, this is Andrew Kramer, a Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 86 of war in Ukraine, and this is the third week of October 2023. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about two things. Avdiivka heavy fighting continues, and Russia losing massive number of people and tanks. And we're also going to talk about Ukraine armed forces successfully moved its offensive on the right bank of the Dnieper River in the Kherson region. Now, at the front lines, the most important and severe battle happens in Avdiivka. So, as you see, the Russian forces shifted their offensive from Bakhmut to Avdiivka. And as we talked about that in the last podcast, the Russian military operation to capture the settlement, a suburb of Donetsk, didn't end very well. But it must be said that the Russians attached even more importance to this operation than we could even imagine. The main military goal is to divert Ukrainian reserves from the south, from the Robotne village district, and move them away. This is the first military task. The second task is to move the front line away from Donetsk. And the plus we was the other goal was a political goal of the Russians. Why they wanted to capture Avdiivka, but because it was very necessary to give Putin a big, beautiful military victory before his nomination for another presidential term, which is planned for the end of October or the beginning of November. So, for the implementation of this current Avdiivka operation, huge Russian forces were gathered in the region. Artillery training was carried out for almost a day, and before that, combat reconnaissance was also conducted. On October 9th, all this happened. They were beaten very powerfully by the Ukrainians. This was noted by both Ukrainian and Russian sources. A huge number of shells and bombs were fired at Avdiivka village. On October 10th, the infantry and tanks went forward, and from that moment, everything went wrong for the Russians. The Ukrainians knew and were clearly preparing for the upcoming attack and with deadly precision began to destroy the advancing Russian troops. During the initial advance of the Russians, several Ukrainian positions were captured, but literally within a day they were regained by Ukrainians and all the previously captured positions were pushed back. Moreover, the advancing Russians suffered huge losses on the very first day. In a few days, 1,500 combat vehicles, including tanks, were blown up there, and more than 1,000 people of Russian forces, of Russian military, were killed. And the mood of Russian Z bloggers on this news became completely gloomy. They already proposed to stop the offensive. They said that there is no point in it since success was not achieved in the first or 2 or 3 days. So there is no particular point in advancing further, especially since the element of sadness has been lost. For a week, the Russians stormed this Avdiivka region, and a few days ago, their onslaught seemed to have eased. I thought, well, that's all. I get I guess the infantry has run out, the tanks have run out, but no. On the 9th of October, Russian reserves came to the front and another very powerful attack was launched on Avdiivka. Actually, dozens of tanks, combat vehicles, infantry, armored personnel carriers, and thousands of Russian troops. God knows what else. Thousands of people, several brigades directly threw themselves into the breakthrough. On October 22, Russian infantry launched 5 attacks north of Avdiivka, but all attacks were repulsed by Ukraine armed forces. The maximum advance of Russian troops was up to 1.5 kilometers deep on the front and kilometer wide. The enemy reached a narrow section of the railway line and the foot of the Avdiivka territory. The Russians cannot occupy our positions on the artificial hill Terikon itself. It has become a gray zone that can be seen and shot through. Russian assault groups climbed the Terikon several times, but most of the troopers were destroyed, and the Russians couldn't gain a foothold on the Terikon hill, sitting at the foot of it. And as explained last time, the Ukrainian positions are on man-made hill, and that was easy to destroy all the troops and shoot at them all these last 2 weeks long. The tactical situation remains favorable for Ukrainian troops. The 110th Mechanized Brigade and its attached units held the flanks and commanding heights. Russian troops crawled into the narrow pocket in the lowlands, which was controlled by fire. And now the Russians must make a rotation, a maneuver with heavy losses. The Russians will not be able to hold their position in the lowlands if they are under such a constant fire. Let me remind you that 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation launched an offensive north of Avdiivka on the village of Stepove Berdichi with the aim of cutting the main road connecting the city with the city on October 1st. On October 10th and 14th, the Russians launched additional forces into the attack. Two fresh motorized rifle brigades, the 15th and 21st. Also, a few days later, on October 19th, the 4th Brigade, the 30th Motorized Rifle Brigade, was thrown into the breakthrough. And the latest, on October 2022, the Russians stopped massive attack with armored vehicles due to heavy losses. To continue the assault operations, collective assault detachments are being formed from the compositions of four brigades and other divisions of the First Corps. The Russians are pulling up additional reserves from 106th Airborne Division and separate tank battalions. More than 200 units of Russian armed vehicles were destroyed and damaged in the zone of the 110th Brigade and attached force alone. Phenomenal numbers. Hundreds of corpses are laying on the plantation and fields. The count continues, but the occupiers lost at least 100 people. At least 100 people. 30 Russian attack aircrafts were captured. They look well motivated and prepared, but they raised their hands because they made a wise choice and will actually leave. The Ukrainian soldiers proved to be stronger. Ukraine owes for keeping the Avdiivka region and keeping it under its control to the personnel of the 110th Mechanized Brigade and the attached forces of the 2nd Battalion of the Presidential Brigade. There is no words to describe the heroism of the soldiers of the 110th Mechanized Brigade. This brigade has been defending Avdiivka village without any rotation at all for 1.5 years. A significant number of units constantly in their positions without any exits from the region, which is fired at by all types of weapons. Our soldiers are tired from long battles. The Russians also hope that the Ukrainians will get tired of killing them as well. The defenders of Avdiivka need to be replenished and strengthened to be able to gradually give rest to the soldiers during the 23 days of continuous combat in the Avdiivka. Currently, the enemy is trying to ease the situation by creating an advantage in south of Avdiivka. The enemy is trying to break through the defense of the 53rd Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in the Vodine Opitna area. The enemy has an advance in this area. However, the Ukrainian troops reliably hold the flanks and inflict significant losses on the Russians. The 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade reliably holds all positions and repulses all enemy attacks in the direction of Pervomaisky with significant losses for the Russians. The south part of Avdiivka, Ukrainian troops also have all the possibilities for successful defense and defeat of the Russian strike group. Everything depends on the timely and thoughtful use of reserves and military equipment. In general, the crisis in the Avdiivka region is not over yet. Holding the front and powerful strikes against the occupiers came at a high price for Ukrainian soldiers. We have so many people wounded. We have so many soldiers killed. The Ukrainian combat command received enough time to react and, of course, is raising reserves. All Russian attacks have been repulsed. The Russian advance is dangerous, but the main line of defense has held, and holding what the Russians have captured will be much more difficult than continue to attack further. So let's talk about the successful attack of the left bank of Dnipro River in the Kherson region. So the left bank of the Dnipro region was attacked by Ukrainian armed forces and kicked out the Russian troops from the few villages. So if you remember, the left bank of the Kherson is under Ukrainian control, and the bridge to the right bank was totally destroyed. So now the only way is to attack the Russian forces on the right bank is to cross the river. I'm sorry, on the left bank to cross the river. So the right bank is controlled by Ukrainians. The left bank is controlled by Russians. So the armed forces raided the occupiers part of the Kherson region and were able to seize position of 4 kilometers from the Dnipro River toward the Russian troops. On October 17th and 18th, separate units of the armed forces of Ukraine made a breakthrough across the Dnipro into the occupied part of the Kherson region in the area of villages Oleshkiv community. Judging by the reaction of the Russian military forces, this operation may be more significant than the previous similar raids of the armed forces of Ukraine. Russian sources claim that on October 17th and 18th, the forces of two Ukrainian Marine brigades stormed across the Dnieper to the eastern left bank of the Kherson region. Geolocated footage published on October 18th shows that the forces of the Ukrainian army advanced north of Pishanivka village, which is 14 kilometers east of the city of Kherson and 3 kilometers from the Dnipro River, and to the village of Poima, which located 11 kilometers east of the city of Kherson and 4 kilometers from the Dnipro River. Both villages are in the Oleshkiv community of the Kherson region. One prominent Russian military blogger claimed that two Ukrainian assault groups landed on the east bank of the Dnipro River and broke through the initial Russian defenses, temporarily occupying the entire Poima village and positions on the northern outskirts of Pishanivka village on the afternoon of October 17th. Later, Russian most popular Z blogger stated that the Russian troops allegedly pushed back the forces of Ukraine from these positions toward the Dnipro River. But at the same time, he admitted that as of mid afternoon on October 18th, Ukrainian sabotage group continued to operate in Pishinivka. In addition, the Russian blogger said that the Russian troops only hold positions on the southern outskirts of the settlement. The Russian Ministry of Defense also acknowledged that Ukrainian operations, claiming that occupiers allegedly stopped for Ukrainian uh, assault groups near Podsterny, which is 16 kilometers east of Kherson, and Poima. In another well known Russian pro war publication, it was said that the armed forces occupied Poima on the night of October 17th of 18th. So, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russian sources have expressed clear concern about the current operation of the armed forces of Ukraine on the eastern bank of the Kherson region and write about it as an alleged part of potential larger Ukrainian operation. At the same time, most of the Russian statements about the events on the eastern bank mostly come from the source from well-known Russian military commander who recently focused his attention on this part on the front. So Russian sources characterize the attack as an attempt by Ukraine to expand the bridgehead on the eastern bank and as the alleged initial stage of a larger offensive operation across the Dnipro River. So the Russian dictator Putin, at a briefing for Russian mass media in China, also called the new Ukrainian operation in the Kherson region another counteroffensive and continued his typical rhetoric, calling all Ukraine offensive operations just failures. Concerns of the occupiers about the ability of the Russian military to respond to a possible offensive operation of Ukraine across the Dnieper River might be partly related to the state of the Russian grouping of forces on the left bank. In the recent months, the Russian command has withdrawn a relatively significant number of elite units from the Kherson area to support Russian defensive operations in the Zaporizhia region, because it probably considers the Kherson region as a quiet sector. So the current composition of the occupying forces in the area is probably relatively less capable. On October 17th, the Speaker of the Southern Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Natalia Gumenyuk, said that the Russian troops continue to redeploy trained units from the Kherson direction to the Zaporizhia and the eastern directions. It is possible that the Russian military recently deploys units of 41st Combined Army Central Military District of the Russian Federation and the 810th Marine Brigade in the Kherson direction, but it's not yet clear where exactly. It was previously reported that the counteroffensive operations of Ukraine armed forces in other areas of the front led to the fact that as of September 22, the 810th Brigade was completely disabled. The Institute for the Study of War declares that it refrains from evaluating the scope and prospects of the current operation of the armed forces of Ukraine on the eastern bank of the Kherson region. As of this time, the analysts have yet to claim that the armed forces have created a sufficient bridgehead on the eastern shore of the Kherson region which be suitable for the further maneuver of significant mechanized forces. However, they emphasize that the most prominent Russian sources discuss the Ukraine operation on the eastern bank as a larger than previously documented tactics raised by Ukrainian forces across the Dnipro River. So the Institute for the Study of War will continue to closely monitor the area of the front and assess changes in the terrain control and Russia's response in line with ongoing policy of not predicting Ukraine's actions. Glory to Ukrainian soldiers. We know that this war takes lots of lives of Ukrainians, and we truly value what these men do, not only for Ukraine, but for the democracy of the European region. Thank you for listening. Please share my podcast with your friends.